Part 1 of History of the 30 Years' War, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. History of the 30 Years' War, Volume 5, by Friedrich Schiller, Part 1. Wallenstein's death rendered necessary the appointment of a new generalissimo, and the Emperor yielded at last to the advice of the Spaniard to raise his son Ferdinand, King of Hungary, to that dignity. Under him Count Gallas commanded, who performed the function of commander-in-chief, while the prince brought to this post nothing but his name and dignity. A considerable force was soon assembled under Ferdinand. The Duke of Lorraine brought up a considerable body of auxiliaries in person, and the Cardinal Infante joined him from Italy with 10,000 men. In order to drive the enemy from the Danube, the new general undertook the enterprise in which his predecessor had failed, the Siege of Ratisbon. In vain did Duke Bernard of Weimar penetrate into the interior of Bavaria, with a view to draw the enemy from the town. Ferdinand continued to press the siege with vigour, and the city, after a most obstinate resistance, was obliged to open its gates to him. Donauwörth soon shared the same fate, and Nordlingen in Swabia was now invested. The loss of so many of the imperial cities was severely felt by the Swedish party, as the friendship of these towns had so largely contributed to the success of their arms. Indifference to their fate would have been inexcusable. It would have been an indelible disgrace had they deserted their confederates in their need, and abandoned them to the revenge of an implacable conqueror. Moved by this consideration, the Swedish army, under the command of Horn and Bernard of Weimar, advanced upon Nordlingen, determined to relieve it even at the expense of a battle. The undertaking was a dangerous one, for in numbers the enemy was greatly superior to that of the Swedes. There was also a further reason for avoiding a battle at present. The enemy's force was likely soon to divide, the Italian troops being destined for the Netherlands. In the meantime, such a position might be taken up as to cover Nordlingen and cut off their supplies. All these grounds were strongly urged by Gustavus Horn in the Swedish Council of War, but his remonstrances were disregarded by men who, intoxicated by a long career of success, mistook the suggestions of prudence for the voice of timidity. Overborne by the superior influence of Duke Bernard, Gustavus Horn was compelled to risk a contest, whose unfavourable issue a dark foreboding seemed already to announce. The fate of battle depended upon the possession of a height which commanded the imperial camp. An attempt to occupy it during the night failed, as the tedious transport of the artillery through woods and hollow ways delayed the arrival of the troops. When the Swedes arrived about midnight, they found the heights in possession of the enemy, strongly entrenched. They waited, therefore, for daybreak to carry them by storm. Their impetuous courage surmounted every obstacle. The entrenchments, which were in the form of a crescent, were successfully scaled by each of the two brigades appointed to the service, but as they entered at the same moment from opposite sides, they met and drew each other into confusion. At this unfortunate moment, a barrel of powder blew up, and created the greatest disorder among the Swedes. The imperial cavalry charged upon their broken ranks, and the flight became universal. No persuasion on the part of their general could induce the fugitives to renew the assault. He resolved, therefore, in order to carry this important post, to lead fresh troops to the attack. But in the interim, some Spanish regiments had marched in, and every attempt to gain it was repulsed by their heroic intrepidity. One of the Duke's own regiments advanced 7 times, and was as often driven back. The disadvantage of not occupying this post in time was quickly and sensibly felt. The fire of the enemy's artillery from the heights caused such a slaughter in the adjacent wing of the Swedes, that Horn, who commanded there, was forced to give orders to retire. Instead of being able to cover the retreat of his colleagues, and to check the pursuit of the enemy, Duke Bernard, overpowered by numbers, was himself driven into the plain, where his routed cavalry spread confusion among Horn's brigades, and rendered the defeat complete. Almost the entire infantry were killed or taken prisoners. More than 12,000 men remained dead upon the field of battle. 80 field pieces, about 4,000 wagons, and 300 standards and colours fell into the hands of the Imperialists. Horn himself, with 3 other generals, were taken prisoners. Duke Bernard with difficulty saved the feeble remnant of his army, which joined him at Frankfurt. The defeat at Nordlingen cost the Swedish Chancellor the second sleepless night he had passed in Germany. The first was occasioned by the death of Gustavus Adolphus. The consequences of this disaster was terrible. The Swedes had lost by it at once their superiority in the field, and with it the confidence of their confederates, which they had gained solely by their previous military success. A dangerous division threatened the Protestant Confederation with ruin. Consternation and terror seized upon the whole party, while the Papists arose with exulting triumph from the deep humiliation into which they had sunk. Swabia and the adjacent circles first felt the consequences of the defeat of Nordlingen, and Württemberg, in particular, was overrun by the conquering army. All the members of the League of Heilbronn trembled at the prospect of Emperor's revenge. Those who could fled to Strasbourg, while the helpless free cities awaited their fate with alarm. A little more of moderation toward the conquered would have quickly reduced all the weaker states under Emperor's authority, but the severity which was practised even against those who voluntarily surrendered drove the rest to despair, and roused them to a vigorous resistance. In this perplexity, all looked to Oxenstiern for counsel and assistance. Oxenstiern applied for both to the German states. Troops are wanted, money likewise, to raise new levies, and to pay to the old the arrears which the men were clamorously demanding. Oxenstiern addressed himself to the Elector of Saxony, but he shamefully abandoned the Swedish cause to negotiate for a separate peace with the Emperor at Pirna. He solicited aid from the Lower Saxon states, but they, long wearied of Swedish pretensions and demands for money, now thought only of themselves. And George, Duke of Lunenburg, in place of flying to the assistance of the Upper Germany, laid siege to Minden, with the intention of keeping possession of it for himself. Abandoned by his German allies, the Chancellor exerted himself to obtain the assistance of foreign powers. England, Holland, and Venice were applied to for troops and money, and driven to the last extremity, the Chancellor reluctantly resolved to take the disagreeable step which he had so long avoided, and to throw himself under the protection of France. The moment had at last arrived which Richelieu had long waited for with impatience. Nothing, he was aware, but the impossibility of saving themselves by any other means could induce the Protestant states in Germany to support the pretension of France upon Alsace. This extreme necessity had now arrived. The assistance of that power was indispensable, and she was resolved to be well paid for the active part which she was about to take in the German war. Full of lustre and dignity, it now came upon the political stage. Oxenstiern, who felt little reluctance in bestowing the rights and possessions of the empire, had already seized the fortress of Philipsburg and other long coveted places. The Protestants of Upper Germany now, in their own names, sent a special embassy to Richelieu, requesting him to take Alsace, the fortress of Breisach, which was still to be recovered from the enemy, and all the places upon the Upper Rhine, which were the keys of Germany under the protection of France. What was implied by French protection had been seen in the conduct of France toward the bishopric of Metz, Toul, and Verdun, which it had held for centuries against the rightful owners. Trevor was already in the possession of French garrisons. Lorraine was in a manner conquered, as it might at any time be overrun by an army, and could not, alone and with its own strength, withstand its formidable neighbour. France now entertained the hope of adding Alsace to its large and numerous possessions, and, since a treaty was soon to be concluded with the Dutch for the partition of the Spanish Netherlands, the prospect of making the Rhine its natural boundary toward Germany. Thus shamefully were the rights of Germany sacrificed the German states to this treacherous and grasping power, which, under the mask of a disinterested friendship, aimed only at its own aggrandizement, and while it boldly claimed the honourable title of a protectress, was solely occupied with promoting its own schemes, and advancing its own interests amid the general confusion. In return for these important cessions, France engaged to effect a diversion in favour of the Swedes by commencing hostilities against the Spaniards, and if this should lead to an open breach with the Emperor, to maintain an army upon German side of the Rhine, which was to act in conjunction with the Swedes and Germans against Austria. For a war with Spain, the Spaniards themselves soon afforded the desired pretext. Making an inroad from the Netherlands upon the city of Trèves, they cut in pieces the French garrison, and, in open violation of the law of nations, made prisoner the Elector, who had placed himself under the protection of France, and carried him into Flanders. When the Cardinal Infante, as Viceroy of Spanish Netherlands, refused satisfaction for these injuries, and delayed to restore the prince to liberty, Richelieu, after the old custom, formally proclaimed a war at Brussels by a herald, and the war was at once opened by 3 different armies in Milan, in Valtelline, and in Flanders. The French minister was less anxious to commence hostilities with the Emperor, which promised fewer advantages, and threatened greater difficulties. A 4th army, however, was detached across the Rhine into Germany, under the command of Cardinal Lavalette, which was to act in conjunction with Duke Bernard against the Emperor without previous declaration of war. A heavier blow for Swedes than even the defeat of Nordlingen was the reconciliation of the Elector of Saxony with the Emperor. After many fruitless attempts both to bring about and to prevent it, it was at last effected in 1634 at Pirna, and the following year reduced into a formal treaty of peace at Prague. The Elector of Saxony was always viewed with jealousy the pretension of the Swedes in Germany, and his aversion to this foreign power, which now gave laws within the empire, had grown with every fresh requisition that Oxenstiern was obliged to make upon the German states. This ill feeling was kept alive by the Spanish court, who laboured honestly to effect a peace between Saxony and the Emperor. Wearied with the calamities of long and destructive contest, which had selected Saxony above all others for its theatre, grieved by the miseries which both friends and foe inflicted upon its subject, and seduced by the tempting propositions of the House of Austria, the Elector at last abandoned the common cause, and caring little for the fate of his confederates, or the liberties of Germany, thought only of securing his own advantages, even at the expense of the whole body. In fact, the misery of Germany had risen to such a height, that all clamorously vociferated for peace. Even the most disadvantaged pacification would have been hailed as a blessing from heaven. The plains, which formerly had been thronged with a happy and industrious population, where nature had lavished her choicest gifts, and plenty and prosperity had reigned, were now a wild and desolate wilderness. The fields, abandoned by the industrious husbandman, lay waste and uncultivated, and no sooner had the young crops given the promise of a smiling harvest than a single march destroyed the labors of a year, and blasted the last hope of an afflicted peasantry. Burnt castles, wasted fields, villages in ashes were to be seen extending far and wide on all sides, while the ruined peasantry had no resource left but to swell the hordes of the incendiaries, and fearfully to retaliate upon their fellows, who had hitherto been spared the miseries which they themselves had suffered. The only safeguard against oppression was to become an oppressor. The towns groaned under the licentiousness of undisciplined and plundering garrisons, who seized and wasted the property of the citizens, and under the license of their position committed the most remorseless devastation and cruelty. If the march of an army converted whole provinces into desert, if others were impoverished by winter quarters or exhausted by contributions, these still were but passing evils, and the industry of a year might efface the miseries of a few months. But there was no relief for those who had a garrison within their walls or in the neighborhood. Even the change of fortune could not improve their unfortunate fate, since the victor trod in the steps of vanquished, and friends were not more merciful than enemies. The neglected farms, the destruction of the crops, and the numerous armies which overran the exhausted country were inevitably followed by scarcity and the high price of provisions, which in the later years was still further increased by a general failure in the crops. The crowding together of men in camps and quarters, want upon one side and excess on the other, occasioned contagious distempers, which were more fatal than even the sword. In this long and general confusion, all bonds of social life were broken up. Respect for the rights of their fellow men, the fear of laws, purity of morals, honor, and religion were laid aside, where might ruled supreme with iron scepter. Under the shelter of anarchy and impunity, every vice flourished, and men became as wild as the country. No station was too dignified for outrage, no property too holy for rapine and avarice. In a word, the soldier reigned supreme, and that most brutal of despots often made his own officer feel his power. The leader of army was a far more important person within any country where he appeared, than its lawful governor, who was frequently obliged to fly before him into his own castle for safety. Germany swarmed with these petty tyrants, and the country suffered equally from its enemies and its protectors. These wounds rankled the deeper when the unhappy victims recollected that Germany was sacrificed to the ambition of foreign powers, who for their own ends prolonged the miseries of war. Germany bled under the scourge to extend the conquest and influence of Sweden, and the torch of discord was kept alive within the empire, that the service of Richelieu might be rendered indispensable in France. But in truth, it was not merely interested voices which opposed the peace. And if both Sweden and German states were anxious, from corrupt motives, to prolong the conflict, they were seconded in their views by sound policy. After the defeat of Nordlingen, an equitable peace was not to be expected from the Emperor, and this being the case, was it not too great a sacrifice, after 17 years of war, with all its miseries, to abandon the contest, not only without advantage, but even with loss? What would avail so much bloodshed, if all was to remain as it had been, if their rights and pretensions were neither larger nor safer, if all that had been won with so much difficulty was to be surrendered for peace at any cost? Would it not be better to endure for 2 or 3 years more the burdens they had borne so long, and to reap at last some recompense for 20 years of suffering? Neither was it doubtful that peace might at last be obtained on favourable terms, if only the Swedes and German Protestants should continue united in the cabinet and in the field. and pursued their common interest with reciprocal sympathy and zeal. Their divisions alone had rendered the enemy formidable, and protracted the acquisition of a lasting and general peace. And this great evil the Elector of Saxony had brought upon the Protestant cause by concluding a separate treaty with Austria. He, indeed, had commenced his negotiations with the Emperor even before the Battle of Nordlingen, and the unfortunate issue of the battle only accelerated their conclusion. By it, all his confidence in the Swedes was lost, and it was even doubted whether they would ever recover from the blow. The jealousies among their generals, the insubordination of the army, and the exhaustion of the Swedish kingdom shut out any reasonable prospect of effective assistance on their part. The Elector hastened, therefore, to profit by the Emperor's magnanimity, who, even after the battle of Nordlingen, did not recall the conditions previously offered. While Oxenstiern, who had assembled the estates in Frankfurt, made further demands upon them and him, the Emperor, on the contrary, made concessions, and therefore it required no long consideration to decide between them. In the meantime, however, he was anxious to escape the charge of sacrificing the common cause, and attending only to his own interest. All the German states, and even the Swedes, were publicly invited to become parties to this peace, although Saxony and the Emperor were the only powers who deliberated upon it, and who assumed the right to give law to Germany. By this self-appointed tribunal, the grievances of Protestants were discussed, their rights and privileges decided, and even the fate of religion determined, without presence of those who were most deeply interested in it. Between them, a general peace was resolved on, and it was to be enforced by an imperial army of execution, as a formal decree of the empire. Whoever opposed it was to be treated as a public enemy, and thus, contrary to their rights, the states were to be compelled to acknowledge a law, in the passing of which they had no share. Thus, even in form, the pacification at Prague was an arbitrary measure, nor was it less so in its contents. The Edict of Restitution had been the chief cause of dispute between the Elector and the Emperor, and therefore it was first considered in their deliberations. Without formally annulling it, it was determined by the Treaty of Prague that all the ecclesiastical domains holding immediately of the empire, and, among the immediate ones, those which had been seized by the Protestant subsequently to the treaty at Passau, should for 40 years remain in the same position as they had been in before the Edict of Restitution, but without any formal decision to the Diet to that effect. Before the expiration of this term, a commission, composed of equal numbers of both religions, should proceed to settle the matter peaceably and according to law, and if this commission should be unable to come to a decision, each party should remain in possession of the right which it had exercised before the Edict of Restitution. This arrangement, therefore, far from removing the grounds of dissension, only suspended the dispute for a time, and this article of the Treaty of Prague only covered the embers of a future war. The Archbishopric of Magdeburg remained in possession of Prince Augustus of Saxony, and Halberstadt in that of Archduke Leopold William. 4 estates were taken from the territory of Magdeburg and given to Saxony, for which the administrator of Magdeburg, Christian William of Brandenburg, was otherwise to be indemnified. The Dukes of Mecklenburg, upon acceding to this treaty, were to be acknowledged as rightful possessors of their territories, in which the magnanimity of Gustavus Adolphus had long ago reinstated them. Donauwörth recovered its liberties. The important claims of heirs of the Palatine, however important it might be for the Protestant cause not to lose this electorate vote in the Diet, were passed over in the consequence of the animosity subsisting between the Lutherans and the Calvinists. All the conquests which, in the course of the war, had been made by the German states, or by the League and the Emperor, were to be mutually restored. All which had been appropriated by foreign powers of France and Sweden was to be forcibly wrested from them by united powers. The troops of contracting parties were to be formed into one imperial army, which, supported and paid by the empire, was by force of arms to carry into execution the covenants of the treaty. As the Peace of Prague was intended to serve as a general law of the empire, those points which did not immediately affect the latter formed the subject of a separate treaty. By it, Lusatia was ceded to the Elector of Saxony as a fief of Bohemia, and special articles guaranteed the freedom of religion of this country and of Silesia. All the Protestant states were invited to accede to the Treaty of Prague, and on that condition were to benefit by the amnesty. The princes of Württemberg and Baden, whose territories the emperor was already in possession of, and which he was not disposed to restore unconditionally, and such vassals of Austria as had borne arms against their sovereign, and those states which, under the direction of Oxenstiern, composed the Council of the Upper German Circle, were excluded from the treaty, not so much with the view of continuing the war against them, as of compelling them to purchase peace at a dearer rate. Their territories were to be retained in pledge, till everything should be restored to its former footing. Such was the Treaty of Prague. Equal justice, however, towards all might perhaps have restored confidence between the head of the empire and its members, between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics, between the Reformed and the Lutheran party, and the Swedes, abandoned by all their allies, would in all probability have been driven from Germany with disgrace. But this inequality strengthened, in those who were more severely treated, the spirit of mistrust and opposition, and made it an easier task for Swedes to keep alive the flame of war and to maintain a party in Germany. The Peace of Prague, as might have been expected, was received with very various feelings throughout Germany. The attempt to conciliate both parties had rendered it obnoxious to both. The Protestants complained of the restraints imposed upon them. The Roman Catholics thought that these hated sectaries had been favored at the expense of the true Church. In the opinion of the latter, the Church had been deprived of its inalienable rights by the concessions to the Protestants of 40 years' undisturbed possession of the ecclesiastical benefices, while the former murmured that the interest of the Protestant Church had been betrayed, because toleration had not been granted to their co-religionists in the Austrian dominions. But no one was so bitterly reproached as the Elector of Saxony, who was publicly denounced as a deserter, a traitor to religion and the liberty of the empire, and a confederate of the emperor. End of Part 1. Part 2 of History of the 30 Years' War, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. History of the 30 Years' War, Volume 5, by Friedrich Schiller, Part 2. In the meantime, he consoled himself with the triumph of seeing most of the Protestant states compelled by necessity to embrace this peace. The Elector of Brandenburg, Duke William of Weimar, the Princes of Anhalt, the Dukes of Mecklenburg, the Dukes of Brunswick-Lunenburg, the Hanse-towns, and most of the imperial cities acceded to it. The Landgrave William of Hesse long wavered, or affected to do so in order to gain time, and to regulate his measures by the course of events. He had conquered several fertile provinces of Westphalia, and derived from them principally the means of continuing the war. These, by the terms of the treaty, he was bound to restore. Bernard, Duke of Weimar, whose state as yet existed only on paper, as a belligerent power was not affected by the treaty, but as a general was so materially, and in either view, he must equally be disposed to reject it. His whole riches consisted in his bravery, his possessions in his sword. War alone gave him greatness and importance, and war alone could realize the project which his ambition suggested. But of all who declaimed against the Treaty of Prague, none was so loud in their clamours as the Swede, and none had so much reason for their opposition. Invited to Germany by the Germans themselves, the champions of the Protestant Church, and the freedom of states, which they had defended with so much bloodshed, and with the sacred life of their king, they now saw themselves suddenly and shamefully abandoned, disappointed in all their hopes, without reward and without gratitude, driven from the empire for which they have toiled and bled, and exposed to the ridicule of the enemy by the very princes who owed everything to them. No satisfaction, no indemnification for the expenses which they had incurred, no equivalent for the conquest which they were to leave behind them, was provided by the Treaty of Prague. They were to be dismissed poorer than they came, or if they resisted, to be expelled by the very powers who had invited them. The Elector of Saxony at least spoke of a pecuniary indemnification, and mentioned the small sum of 2,500,000 florins, but the Swede had already expended considerably more, and this disgraceful equivalent in money was both contrary to their true interest and injurious to their pride. The electors of Bavaria and Saxony, replied Oxenstiern, have been paid for their services which, as vassals, they were bound to render the emperor, with the possessions of important provinces, and shall we, who had sacrificed our king for Germany, be dismissed with the miserable sum of 2,500,000 florins? The disappointment of their expectation was the more severe, because the Swede had calculated upon being recompensed with the Duchy of Pomerania, the present possessor of which was old and without heirs. But the succession of this territory was confirmed by the Treaty of Prague to the Elector of Brandenburg, and all the neighbouring powers declared against allowing the Swede to obtain a footing within the empire. Never in the whole course of the war had the prospect of the Swede looked more gloomy than in the year 1635, immediately after the conclusion of the Treaty of Prague. Many of their allies, particularly among the free cities, abandoned them to benefit by the peace. Others were compelled to accede to it by the victorious arms of the emperor. Augsburg, subdued by famine, surrendered on the severest conditions. Würzburg and Coburg were lost to the Austrians. The League of Heilbronn was formally dissolved. Nearly whole of Upper Germany, the chief seat of Swedish power, was reduced under the emperor. Saxony, on the strength of the Treaty of Prague, demanded the evacuation of Thuringia, Halberstadt, and Magdeburg. Philipsburg, the military depot of France, was surprised by the Austrians with all the stores it contained, and this severe loss checked the activity of France. To complete the embarrassment of Sweden, the truce with Poland was drawing to a close. To support a war at the same time with Poland and in Germany was far beyond the power of Sweden, and all that remained was to choose between them. Pride and ambition declared in favor of continuing the German war, at whatever sacrifice on the side of Poland. An army, however, was necessary to command the respect of Poland, and to give weight to Sweden in any negotiations for truce or peace. The mind of Oxenstiern, firm and inexhaustible in expedients, set itself manfully to meet these calamities, which all combined to overwhelm Sweden, and his shrewd understanding taught him how to turn even misfortunes to his advantage. The defection of so many German cities of the empire deprived him, it is true, of a great part of his former allies, but at the same time it freed him from the necessity of paying any regard to their interest. The more the number of his enemies increased, the more provinces and magazines were open to his troops. The gross ingratitude of the states, and the haughty contempt with which the emperor behaved, who did not even condescend to treat directly with him about a peace, excited him in the courage of despair and noble determination to maintain the struggle to the last. The continuance of war, however unfortunate it might prove, could not render the situation of Sweden worse than it now was, and if Germany was to be evacuated, it was at least better and nobler to do so sword in hand, and to yield to force rather than to fear. In the extremity in which the Swedes were now placed by the desertion of their allies, they addressed themselves to France, who met them with the greatest encouragement. The interests of the two crowns were closely united, and France would have injured herself by allowing the Swedish power in Germany to decline. The helpless situation of the Swedes was rather an additional motive with France to cement more closely their alliance, and to take a more active part in the German war. Since the alliance with Sweden at Beerwald in 1632, France had maintained the war against the emperor by the arms of Gustavus Adolphus, without any open or formal breach, by furnishing subsidies and increasing the number of his enemies. But, alarmed at the unexpected rapidity and success of the Swedish arms, France, in anxiety to restore the balance of power, which was disturbed by the preponderance of the Swedes, seemed, for a time, to have lost sight of her original designs. She endeavoured to protect the Roman Catholic princes of the empire against the Swedish conqueror, by the treaties of neutrality, and when this plan failed, she even meditated herself to declare war against him. But no sooner had the death of Gustavus Adolphus and the desperate situation of the Swedish affairs dispelled this apprehension, than she returned with a fresh zeal to her first design, and readily afforded in this misfortune the aid which in the hour of success she had refused. Freed from the checks which the ambition and vigilance of Gustavus Adolphus placed upon her plans of aggrandizement, France availed herself of the favourable opportunity afforded by the defeat of Nordlingen to obtain the entire direction of the war, and to prescribe laws to those who sued for her powerful protection. The moment seemed to smile upon her boldest plans, and those which had formerly seemed chimerical now appeared to be justified by circumstances. She now turned her whole attention to the war in Germany, and as soon as she had secured her own private ends by a treaty with the Germans, she suddenly entered the political arena as an active and a commanding power. While the other belligerent states had been exhausting themselves in a tedious contest, France had been reserving her strength, and maintained the contest by money alone. And now, when the state of things called for more active measures, she seized the sword, and astonished Europe by the boldness and magnitude of her undertakings. At the same moment she fitted out 2 fleets and sent 6 different armies into the field, while she subsidized the foreign crown and several of the German princes. Animated by this powerful cooperation, the Swedes and the Germans awoke from the consternation, and hoped, sword in hand, to obtain a more honourable peace than that of Prague. Abandoned by their confederates who had been reconciled to the emperor, they formed a still closer alliance with France, which increased her support with their growing necessities, at the same time taking a more active, although secret share in the German war, until at last she threw off the mask altogether, and in her own name made an unequivocal declaration of war against the emperor. To leave Sweden at full liberty to act against Austria, France commenced her operations by liberating it from all fear of a Polish war. By means of the Count de Vaux, its minister, an agreement was concluded between the two powers at Stummsdorf in Prussia, by which the truce was prolonged for 26 years, though not without a great sacrifice on the part of the Swede, who ceded by a single stroke of the pen almost the whole of Polish Prussia, the dear-bought conquest of Gustavus Adolphus. The Treaty of Beerwald was, with certain modifications which circumstances rendered necessary, renewed at different times in Compiègne, and afterwards at Wismar and Hamburg. France had already come to a rupture with Spain in May 1635, and the vigorous attack which it made upon that power deprived the Emperor of his most valuable auxiliaries from the Netherlands. By supporting the Landgrave William of Kassel and Duke Bernard of Weimar, the Swedes were enabled to act with more vigour upon the Elbe and the Danube, and the diversion upon the Rhine compelled the Emperor to divide his force. The war was now prosecuted with increasing activity. By the Treaty of Prague, the Emperor had lessened the number of his adversaries within the empire, though at the same time the zeal and activity of his foreign enemies had been augmented by it. In Germany his influence was almost unlimited, for, with the exception of few states, he had rendered himself absolute master of the German body and its resources, and was again enabled to act in the character of the Emperor and Sovereign. The first fruit of his power was the elevation of son, Ferdinand III, to the dignity of King of the Romans, to which he was elected by a decided majority of votes, notwithstanding the opposition of Trevor and the heirs of the Elector Palatine. But on the other hand, he had exasperated the Swedes to desperation, had armed the power of France against him, and drawn its troops into the heart of the kingdom. France and Sweden, with their German allies, formed from this moment one firm and compactly united power. The Emperor, with the German states which adhered to him, were equally firm and united. The Swedes, who no longer fought for Germany, but for their own lives, showed no more indulgence. Relieved from the necessity of consulting their German allies, or accounting to them for the plans which they adopted, they acted with more precipitation, rapidity, and boldness. Battles, though less decisive, became more obstinate and bloody. Great achievements, both in bravery and military skill, were performed, but they were but insulated efforts, and being neither dictated by any consistent plan, nor improved by any commanding spirit, had comparatively little influence upon the course of the war. Saxony had bound herself by the Treaty of Prague to expel the Swedes from Germany. From this moment the banners of Saxons and the Imperialists were united. The former confederates were converted into implacable enemies. The Archbishopric of Magdeburg, which by the treaty was ceded to the Prince of Saxony, was still held by the Swedes, and every attempt to recover it by negotiation had proved ineffectual. Hostilities commenced by the Elector of Saxony, recalling all his subjects from the army of Banner, which was encamped upon the Elbe. The officers, long irritated by the accumulation of their arrears, obeyed their summons, and evacuated one quarter after another. As the Saxons at the same time made movement toward Mecklenburg to take Dömitz and to drive the Swedes from Pomerania and the Baltic, Banner suddenly marched thither, relieved Dömitz, and totally defeated the Saxon general Baudissin with 7,000 men, of whom 1,000 were slain, and about the same number taken prisoners. Reinforced by the troops and artillery which had hitherto been employed in Polish Prussia, but which the Treaty of Stummsdorf rendered unnecessary, this brave and impetuous general made, the following year, 1636, a sudden inroad into the electorate of Saxony, where he gratified his inveterate hatred of the Saxons by the most destructive ravages. Irritated by the memory of all the grievances which, during their common campaigns, he and the Swedes had suffered from the haughtiness of the Saxons, and now exasperated to the utmost by the late defection of the Elector, They wreaked upon the unfortunate inhabitants all their rancour. Against Austria and Bavaria, the Swedish soldier had fought from a sense, as it were, of duty, but against the Saxons they contended with all the energy of private animosity and personal revenge, detesting them as deserters and traitors. For the hatred of former friends is of all the most fierce and irreconcilable. The powerful diversion made by Duke of Weimar and Landgrave of Hesse upon the Rhine and Westphalia prevented the Emperor from affording the necessary assistance to Saxony, and left the whole electorate exposed to the destructive ravages of Banner's army. At length the Elector, having formed a junction with the Imperial General Hatzfeld, advanced against Magdeburg, which Banner in vain hastened to relieve. The united army of the Imperialists and the Saxons now spread itself over Brandenburg, wrested several places from Swede, and almost drove them to the Baltic. But, contrary to all expectation, Banner, who had been given up as lost, attacked the Allies on 24th of September 1636 at Wittstock, where a bloody battle took place. The onset was terrific, and the whole force of the enemy was directed against the right wing of the Swede, which was led by Banner in person. The contest was long maintained with equal animosity and obstinacy on both sides. There was not a squadron among Swede which did not return 10 times to the charge, to be as often repulsed, when at last Banner was obliged to retire before the superior numbers of the enemy. His left wing sustained the combat until night, and the second line of the Swede, which had not as yet been engaged, was prepared to renew it the next morning. But the Elector did not wait for a second attack. His army was exhausted by the efforts of the preceding day, and as the drivers had fled with the horses, his artillery was unserviceable. He accordingly retreated in the night with Count Hatzfeld, and relinquished the ground to Swede. About 5,000 of the allies fell upon the field, exclusive of those who were killed in the pursuit, or who fell into the hands of the exasperated peasantry. 150 standards and colours, 23 pieces of cannon, the whole baggage and silver plate of the Elector were captured, and more than 2,000 men taken prisoners. This brilliant victory, achieved over an enemy far superior in numbers and in a very advantageous position, restored the Swedes at once to their former reputation. Their enemies were discouraged, and their friends inspired with new hopes. Banner instantly followed up this decisive success, and hastily crossing the Elbe, drove the Imperialists before him through the Thuringia and Hesse into Westphalia. Then he returned and took up his winter quarters in Saxony. But without the material aid furnished by the diversion upon the Rhine, and the activity there of Duke Bernard and the French, these important successes would have been unattainable. Duke Bernard, after the defeat of Nordlingen, reorganized his broken army at Wetterau, but abandoned by the confederates of the League of Heilbronn, which had been dissolved by the Peace of Prague, and receiving little support from the Swedes, he found himself unable to maintain an army, or to perform any enterprise of importance. The defeat at Nordlingen had terminated all his hopes on the Duchy of Franconia, while the weakness of the Swedes destroyed the chance of retrieving his fortunes through their assistance. Tired, too, of the constraint imposed upon him by the imperious chancellor, he turned his attention to France, who could easily supply him with money, the only aid which he required, and France readily acceded to his proposals. Richelieu desired nothing so much as to diminish the influence of the Swedes in German war, and to obtain the direction of it for himself. To secure this end, nothing appeared more effectual than to detach from the Swedes their bravest general, to win him to the interest of France, and to secure for the execution of the project the services of his arm. From a prince like Bernard, who could not maintain himself without foreign support, France has nothing to fear, since no success, however brilliant, could render him independent of that crown. Bernard himself came into France, and in October 1635 concluded a treaty at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, not as a Swedish general, but in his own name, by which it was stipulated that he should receive for himself a yearly pension of 1,500,000 livres, and 4 millions for the support of his army, which he was to command under the orders of the French king. To inflame his zeal and to accelerate the conquest of Alsace, France did not hesitate, by a secret article, to promise him that province for his services, a promise which Richelieu had little intention of performing, and which the Duke also estimated at its real worth. But Bernard confided in his good fortune and in his arms, and met artifice with dissimulation. If he could once succeed in wresting Alsace from the enemy, he did not despair of being able, in case of need, to maintain it also against a friend. He now raised an army at the expense of France, which he commanded nominally under the orders of that power, but in reality without any limitation whatever, and without having wholly abandoned his engagements with Sweden. He began his operations upon the Rhine, where another French army under Cardinal Lavalette had already in 1635 commenced hostilities against the Emperor. Against this force the main body of the Imperialists, after the great victory of Nordlingen and the reduction of Swabia and Franconia had advanced under the command of Gallas, had driven them as far as Metz, cleared the Rhine, and took from the Swedes the towns of Metz and Frankenthal, of which they were in possession. But, frustrated by the vigorous resistance of the French in his main object of taking up his winter quarters in France, he led back his exhausted troops into Alsace and Swabia. At the opening of next campaign, he passed the Rhine at Breisach, and prepared to carry the war into interior of France. He actually entered Burgundy, whilst the Spaniards from the Netherlands made progress in Picardy, and John de Werth, a formidable general of the League, and the celebrated partisan, pushed his march into Champagne, and spread consternation even to the gates of Paris. But an insignificant fortress in Franche-Comté completely checked the Imperialists, and they were obliged second time to abandon their enterprise. End of Part 2. Part 3 of History of the 30 Years' War, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. History of the 30 Years' War, Volume 5, by Friedrich Schiller, Part 3. The activity of Duke Bernard had hitherto been impeded by his dependence on a French general, more suited to the priestly role than to the baton of command. And although, in conjunction with him, he conquered Alsace-Saverne, he found himself unable, in the years of 1636 and 1637, to maintain his position upon the Rhine. The ill success of the French arms in the Netherlands has cheated the activity of operations in Alsace and Breisgau, but in 1638 the war in that quarter took a more brilliant turn. Relieved from his former restraint, and with unlimited command of his troops, Duke Bernard, in the beginning of February, left his winter quarters in the bishopric of Basel, and unexpectedly appeared upon the Rhine, where, at its rude season of the year, an attack was little anticipated. The forest towns of Laufenburg, Waldshut, and Säckingen were surprised, and Rheinfeld besieged. The Duke of Savoy, the imperial general who commanded in that quarter, hastened by forced marches to the relief of this important place, succeeding in raising the siege, and compelled the Duke of Weimar, with great loss, to retire. But, contrary to all human expectation, he appeared on the third day after, 21st February 1638, before the Imperialists, in order of battle, and defeated them in a bloody engagement, in which the 4 imperial generals, Savelli, John de Werth, Enkeford, and Speerreuter, with 2,000 men, were taken prisoners. 2 of these, de Werth and Enkeford, was afterwards sent by Richelieu's order into France, in order to flatter the vanity of the French by the sight of such distinguished prisoners, and by the pomp of military trophies to withdraw the attention of the populace from the public distress. The captured standard and colors were, with the same view, carried in solemn procession to the church of Notre Dame, thrice exhibited before the altar, and committed to sacred custody. The taking of Rheinfeld, Reutlingen, Fribourg was immediate consequence of Duke's victory. His army now increased by considerable recruits, and his project expanded in proportion as fortune favored him. The fortress of Breisach upon the Rhine was looked upon as holding the command of that river, and as the key to Alsace. No place in this quarter was of more importance to the Emperor, and upon none had more care been bestowed. To protect Breisach was the principal destination of the Italian army under the Duke of Feria. The strength of its works and its natural defences bade defiance to assault, while the imperial generals who commanded in that quarter had orders to retain it at any cost. But the Duke, trusting to his good fortune, resolved to attempt the siege. Its strength rendered it impregnable. It could therefore only be stopped into surrender, and this was facilitated by the carelessness of the commandant, who, expecting no attack, had been selling off his stores. As under these circumstances the town could not long hold out, it must be immediately relieved or victualled. Accordingly, the imperial general Goetz rapidly advanced at the head of 12,000 men, accompanied by 3,000 wagons loaded with provisions, which he intended to throw into the place. But he was attacked with such vigor by Duke Bernard at Witteweyer that he lost his whole force except 3,000 men, together with the entire transport. Similar fate at Oxenfeld, near Thann, overtook the Duke of Lorraine, who with 5,000 or 6,000 men advanced to relieve the fortress. After a third attempt of General Goetz for the relief of Breisach had proved ineffectual, the fortress, reduced to the greatest extremity by famine, surrendered after a blockade of 4 months, on the 17th of December 1638, to its equally persevering and humane conqueror. The capture of Breisach opened the boundless field to the ambitions of the Duke of Weimar, and the romance of his hopes were fastly approaching to the reality. Far from intending to surrender his conquest to France, he destined Breisach for himself, and revealed this intention by exacting allegiance from the vanquished in his own name, and not in that of any power. Intoxicated by his past success, and excited by the boldest hopes, he believed that he should be able to maintain his conquest even against France herself. At a time when everything depended upon bravery, when even personal strength was of importance, when troops and generals were of more value than territories, it was natural for a hero like Bernard to place confidence in his own powers, and at the head of an excellent army, who under his command had proved invincible, to believe himself capable of accomplishing the boldest and largest designs. In order to secure himself one friend among the crowd of enemies whom he was about to provoke, he turned his eyes upon the Landgravine Amelia of Hesse, the widow of the lately deceased Landgrave William, a princess whose talents were equal to her courage, and who, along with her hands, would bestow valuable conquests, an extensive principality, and well-disciplined army. By the union of the conquest of Hesse with his own upon the Rhine, and the junction of their forces, a power of some importance, and perhaps a third party might be formed in Germany, which might decide the fate of the war. But a premature death put a period to these extensive schemes. "Courage, Father Joseph, Breisach is ours," whispered Richelieu in the ear of Capuchin, who had long held himself in readiness to be dispatched into that quarter. So delighted was he with this joyful intelligence. Already in imagination he held Alsace, Breisgau, and all the frontiers of Austria in that quarter, without regard to his promise to Duke Bernard. But the firm determination which the latter had unequivocally shown to keep Breisach for himself greatly embarrassed the Cardinal, and no efforts were spared to retain the victorious Bernard in the interest of France. He was invited to court to witness the honours by which his triumph was to be commemorated, but he perceived and shunned the seductive snare. The Cardinal even went so far as to offer him the hand of his niece in marriage, but the proud German prince declined the offer, and refused to sully the blood of Saxony by a misalliance. He was now considered as a dangerous enemy, and treated as such. His subsidies were withdrawn, and the governor of Breisach and his principal officers were bribed, at least upon the event of Duke's death, to take possession of his conquest and to secure his troops. These intrigues were no secret to the Duke, and the precautions he took in the conquered places clearly bespoke the distrust of France. But this misunderstanding with the French court had the most prejudicial influence upon his future operations. The preparations he was obliged to make in order to secure his conquest against an attack on the side of France compelled him to divide his military strength, while the stoppage of his subsidies delayed his appearance in the field. It had been his intention to cross the Rhine, to support the Swedes, and to act against the Emperor and Bavaria on the banks of the Danube. He had already communicated his plan of operations to Banner, who was about to carry the war into the Austrian territories, and had promised to relieve him so, when a sudden death cut short his heroic career in the 36th years of his age at Neuburg upon the Rhine, in July 1639. He died of a pestilential disorder, which in the course of 2 days had carried off nearly 400 men in his camp. The black spots which appeared upon his body, his own dying expressions, and the advantages which France was likely to reap from his sudden decease, gave rise to a suspicion that he had been removed by poison, a suspicion sufficiently refuted by the symptoms of his disorder. In him the Allies lost their greatest general after Gustavus Adolphus, France a formidable competitor for Alsace, and the Emperor his most dangerous enemy. Trained to the duties of soldier and a general in the school of Gustavus Adolphus, he successfully imitated his eminent model, and wanted only a longer life to equal, if not surpass it. With the bravery of a soldier, he united the calm and cool penetration of a general and the persevering fortitude of the man, with the daring resolution of youth, with the wild ardor of the warrior, the sober dignity of the prince, the moderation of the sage, and the conscientiousness of the man of honor. Discouraged by no misfortune, he quickly rose again in full vigor from the severest defeats. No obstacles could check his enterprise. No disappointments conquer his indomitable perseverance. His genius perhaps sought after an unattainable object, but the prudence of such men is to be measured by a different standard from that of ordinary people. Capable of accomplishing more, he might venture to form more daring plans. Bernard affords, in modern history, a splendid example of those days of chivalry, when personal greatness had its full weight and influence, when individual bravery could conquer provinces, and the heroic exploits of a German knight raised him even to the imperial throne. The best part of the Duke's possessions were his army, which, together with Alsace, he bequeathed to his brother William. But to this army both France and Sweden thought that they had well-grounded claims. The latter because it had been raised in name of that crown, and had done homage to it; the former because it had been supported by its subsidies. The Electoral Prince of Palatinate also negotiated for its reserves, and attempted, first by his agent, and latterly in his own person, to win it over to his interest, with the view of employing it in the reconquest of his territories. Even the emperor endeavored to secure it, a circumstance the less surprising when we reflect that at this time the justice of the cause was comparatively unimportant, and the extent of the recompense and the main object to which the soldier looked, and when bravery, like every other commodity, was disposed of to the highest bidder. But France, richer and more determined, outbid all competitors. It bought over General Erlach, the commander of Breisach, and the other officers who soon placed that fortress with the whole army in their hands. The young Palatine, Prince Charles Louis, who had already made an unsuccessful campaign against the emperor, saw his hopes again deceived. Although intending to do France so ill a service as to compete with her for Bernard's army, he had the imprudence to travel through that kingdom. The cardinal, who dreaded the justice of Palatine's cause, was glad to seize any opportunity to frustrate his views. He accordingly caused him to be seized at Moulins, in violation of the law of a nation, and did not set him at liberty until he learned that the army of the Duke of Weimar had been secured. France was now in possession of a numerous and well-disciplined army in Germany, and from this moment began to make open war upon the emperor. But it was no longer against Ferdinand II that its hostilities were to be conducted, for the prince had died in February 1637 in the 59th year of his age. The war which his ambition had kindled, however, survived him. During a reign of 18 years he had never once laid aside the sword, nor tasted the blessing of peace as long as his hand swayed the imperial sceptre. Endowed with the qualities of a good sovereign, adorned with many of those virtues which ensure the happiness of a people, and by nature gentle and humane, we see him, from erroneous ideas of monarch's duty, become at once the instrument and the victim of the evil passions of others. His benevolent intentions frustrated, and the friend of justice converted into the oppressor of mankind, the enemy of peace, and the scourge of his people. Amiable in domestic life, and respectable as a sovereign, but in his policy ill-advised, while he gained the love of his Roman Catholic subjects, he incurred the execration of the Protestants. History exhibits many and greater despots than Ferdinand II, yet he alone has had the unfortunate celebrity of kindling a 30 years' war. But to produce its lamentable consequences, his ambition must have been seconded by a kindred spirit of the age, a congenial state of previous circumstances, and existing seeds of discord. At a less turbulent period, the spark would have found no fuel, and the peacefulness of the age would have choked the voice of individual ambition. Now the flash fell upon a pile of accumulated combustibles, and Europe was in flames. His son, Ferdinand III., who a few months before his father's death had been raised to the dignity of King of the Romans, inherited his throne, his principles, and the war which he had caused. But Ferdinand III. had been a close witness of the sufferings of the people and the devastation of the country, and felt more keenly and ardently the necessity of peace. Less influenced by the Jesuit and the Spaniard, and more moderate toward the religious view of others, he was more likely than his father to listen to the voice of reason. He did so, and ultimately restored to Europe the blessing of peace, but not till after a contest of 11 years waged with the sword and pen, not till after he had experienced the impossibility of resistance, and necessity had laid upon him its stern laws. Fortune favoured him with the commencement of his reign, and his arms were victorious against the Swedes. The latter, under the command of the victorious Banner, had, after their success at Wittstock, had taken up their winter quarters in Saxony, and the campaign of 1637 opened with the Siege of Leipzig. The victorious resistance of the garrison and the approach of the electoral and imperial armies saved the town, and Banner, to prevent his communication with the Elbe being cut off, was compelled to retreat into Torgau. But the superior number of the Imperialists drove him even from that quarter, and surrounded by the enemy, hemmed in by the rivers, and suffering from famine, he had no course open to him but to attempt a highly dangerous retreat into Pomerania, of which the boldness and successful issue border upon romance. The whole army crossed the Oder at the ford near Fürstenberg, and the soldiers, wading up to the neck in water, dragged the artillery across, when the horses refused to draw. Banner had expected to be joined by General Wrangel on the farther side of the Oder in Pomerania, and in conjunction with him to be able to make the head against the enemy. But Wrangel did not appear, and in his stead he found an imperial army posted at Landsberg with a view to cut off the retreat of the Swedes. Banner now saw that he had fallen into a dangerous snare, from which escape appeared impossible. In his rear lay an exhausted country, the Imperialists, and the Oder on his left. The Oder, too, guarded by the Imperial General Buchheim, offered no retreat. In front, Landsberg, Kristin, the Warta, and a hostile army, and on the right, Poland, in which, notwithstanding the truce, little confidence could be placed. In these circumstances his position seemed hopeless, and the Imperialists were already triumphing in the certainty of his fall. Banner, with just indignation, accused the French as the author of this misfortune. They had neglected to make, according to their promise, a diversion upon the Rhine, and by their inaction allowed the Emperor to combine his whole force upon the Swedes. "When the day comes," cried the incensed general to the French commissioner who followed the camp, "that the Swedes and the Germans join their arms against France, we shall cross the Rhine with less ceremony." But reproaches were now useless. What the emergency demanded was energy and resolution. In the hope of drawing the enemy by stratagem from the Oder, Banner pretended to march toward Poland, and dispatched the greater part of his baggage in this direction, with his own wife, and those of other officers. The Imperialists immediately broke up their camp, and hurried toward the Polish frontier to block up the route. Buchheim left his station, and the Oder was stripped of its defenders. On a sudden, and on the cloud of night, Banner turned toward the river, and crossed it about a mile above Kristin, with his troops, baggage, and artillery, without bridge or vessels, as he had done before at Fürstenberg. He reached Pomerania without loss, and prepared to share with Wrangel the defence of that province. But the Imperialists, under the command of Gallas, entered that duchy at Leipzig, overran it by their superior strength. Usedom and Wolgast were taken by storm. Demmin capitulated, and the Swedes were driven far into Lower Pomerania. It was, too, more important for them at this moment than ever to maintain a footing in that country, for Bogislaus XIV had died that year, and Sweden must prepare to establish its title to Pomerania. To prevent the Elector of Brandenburg from making good the title to that duchy, which the Treaty of Prague had given him, Sweden exerted her utmost energies, and supported its general to the extent of her ability, both with troops and money. In other quarters of the kingdom the affairs of Sweden began to wear more favourable aspect, and to recover from the humiliation into which they had been thrown by the inaction of France and the desertion of their allies. For, after their hasty retreat into Pomerania, they had lost one place after another in Upper Saxony. The princes of Mecklenburg, closely pressed by the troops of the Emperor, began to lean to the side of Austria, and even George, Duke of Lunenburg, declared against them. Ehrenbreitstein was starved into a surrender by a Bavarian General de Werth, and the Austrians possessed themselves of all the works which had been thrown up on the Rhine. France had been sufferer in the contest with Spain, and the events had by no means justified the pompous expectation which had accompanied the opening of the campaign. Every place which the Swede had held in the interior of Germany was lost, and only the principal towns in Pomerania still remained in their hands. But a single campaign raised them from this state of humiliation, and the vigorous diversion which the victorious Bernard had effected upon the Rhine gave quite a new turn to affairs. The misunderstanding between France and Sweden were now at last adjusted, and the old treaty between these powers confirmed at Hamburg, with fresh advantage for Sweden. In Hesse, the politic Landgravin Amelia, with the approbation of the estates, assumed the government after the death of her husband, and resolutely maintained her rights against the Emperor and the House of Darmstadt. Already zealously attached to the Swedish Protestant party on religious ground, she only awaited a favourable opportunity openly to declare herself. By artful delays, and by prolonging the negotiations with the Emperor, she had succeeded in keeping him inactive till she had concluded a secret compact with France, and the victories of Duke Bernard had given a favourable turn to the affairs of the Protestants. She now at once threw off the mask and renewed her former alliance with the Swedish crown. The Electoral Prince of the Palatinate was also stimulated by the success of Bernard to try his fortune against the common enemy. Raising troops in Holland with English money, he formed a magazine at Meppen and joined the Swedes in Westphalia. His magazine was, however, quickly lost, his army defeated near Flotta by Count Hatzfeld, but his attempt served to occupy some time the attention of the enemy, and thereby facilitated the operation of Swede in other quarters. Other friends began to appear, as fortune declared in their favour, and the circumstance that the state of Lower Saxony embraced a neutrality was of itself no inconsiderable advantage. End of Part 3. Part 4 of History of the 30 Years' War, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. History of the 30 Years' War, Volume 5, by Friedrich Schiller, Part 4. Under these advantages, and reinforced by 14,000 fresh troops from Sweden and Livonia, Banner opened with the most favourable prospects the campaign of 1638. The Imperialists who were possession of Upper Pomerania and Mecklenburg either abandoned their positions or deserted in crowd to the Swedes to avoid the horrors of famine, the most formidable enemy in this exhausted country. The whole country betwixt the Elbe and the Oder was so desolated by the past marchings and quarterings of the troops, that in order to support his army on its march into Saxony and Bohemia, Banner was obliged to take a circuitous route from Lower Pomerania into Lower Saxony, and then into the Electorate of Saxony through the territory of Halberstadt. The impatience of the Lower Saxon states to get rid of such troublesome guests procured him so plentiful a supply of provisions that he was provided with bread in Magdeburg itself, where famine had even overcome the natural antipathy of man to human flesh. His approach spread consternation among the Saxons, and his views were directed not against this exhausted country, but against the hereditary dominion of the Emperor. The victories of Bernard encouraged him, while the prosperity of the Austrian provinces excited his hope of booty. After defeating the Imperial General Salis at Elsterberg, totally routing the Saxon army at Chemnitz, and taking Pirna, he penetrated with irresistible impetuosity into Bohemia, crossed the Elbe, threatened Prague, took Brandeis and Leutmeritz, defeated General Hofkirchen with 10 regiments, and spread terror and devastation through that defenseless kingdom. Booty was his sole object, and whatever he could not carry off, he destroyed. In order to remove more of the corn, the ears were cut from the stalks, and the latter burnt. Above 1,000 castles, hamlets, and villages were laid in ashes. Sometimes more than 100 were seen burning in one night. From Bohemia he crossed into Silesia, and it was his intention to carry his ravages even into Moravia and Austria. But to prevent this, Count Hatzfeld was summoned from Westphalia, and Piccolomini from the Netherlands, to hasten with all speed to this quarter. The Archduke Leopold, brother to the Emperor, assumed the command, in order to repair the errors of his predecessor Gallas, and to raise the army from the low ebb to which it had fallen. The result justified the change, and the campaign of 1640 appeared to take a most unfortunate turn for the Swedes. They were successfully driven out of all their posts in Bohemia, and anxious only to secure their plunder, they precipitately crossed the heights of Meissen. But being followed into Saxony by the pursuing enemy, and defeated at Plauen, they were obliged to take refuge in Thuringia. Made masters of the field in a single summer, they were as rapidly dispossessed, but only to acquire it a second time, and to hurry from one extreme to another. The army of Banner, weakened and on the brink of destruction in its camp at Erfurt, suddenly recovered itself. The Duke of Lunenburg abandoned the Treaty of Prague, and joined Banner with the very troops which the year before had fought against him. Hesse Castle sent reinforcements, and the Duke of Longueville came to his support with the army of the late Duke Bernard. Once more numerically superior to the Imperialists, Banner offered them battle near Saalfeld, but their leader Piccolomini prudently declined an engagement, having chosen too strong a position to be forced. When the Bavarians at length separated from the Imperialists and marched toward Franconia, Banner attempted an attack upon this divided course, but the attempt was frustrated by the skill of Bavarian General von Mercy, and the near approach of the main body of the Imperialists. Both armies now moved into the exhausted territory of Hesse, where they formed entrenched camp near each other, till at last famine and the severity of the winter compelled them to both retire. Piccolomini chose the fertile banks of the Weser for his winter quarters, but being outflanked by Banner, he was obliged to give way to the Swedes, and to impose on the Franconian sees the burden of maintaining his army. At this period a diet was held in Ratisbon, where the complaints of the states were to be heard, measures taken for securing the repose of the empire, and the question of peace or war finally settled. The presence of the Emperor, the majority of the Roman Catholic voices in the Electoral College, the great number of bishops, and the withdrawal of several of the Protestant votes gave the Emperor a complete command of the deliberation of the assembly, and rendered this diet anything but a fair representative of the opinions of the German Empire. The Protestants with reason considered it as a mere combination of Austria and its creatures against their party, and it seemed to them a laudable effort to interrupt its deliberation, and to dissolve the diet itself. Banner undertook this bold enterprise. His military reputation had suffered by his last retreat from Bohemia, and it stood in need of some great exploit to restore its former lustre. Without communicating his designs to anyone, in the depths of winter of 1641, as soon as the road and the rivers were frozen, he broke off from his quarters in Lunenburg. Accompanied by Marshal Guebriant, who commanded the armies of France and Weimar, he took the route toward the Danube, through Thuringia and Vogtland, and appeared before Ratisbon, ere the Diet could be apprised of his approach. The consternation of the assembly was indescribable, and in the first alarm the deputies prepared for flight. The Emperor alone declared that he would not leave the town, and encouraged the rest by his example. Unfortunately for the Swedes, a thaw came in which broke up the ice upon the Danube, so that it was no longer passable on foot, while no boats could cross it on account of the quantities of ice which were swept down by the current. In order to perform something and to humble the pride of the emperor, Banner discourteously fired 500 cannon shots into the town, which, however, did little mischief. Baffled in his designs, he resolved to penetrate farther into Bavaria and the defenceless province of Moravia, where a rich booty and comfortable quarters awaited his troops. Guebriant, however, began to fear that the purpose of the Swede was to draw the army of Bernard away from the Rhine, and to cut off its communication with France, till it should be either entirely won over, or incapacitated from acting independently. He therefore separated from the Banner to return to the Main, and the latter was exposed to the whole force of the Imperialists, which had been secretly drawn together between Ratisbon and Ingolstadt, and was on its march against him. It was now time to think of a rapid retreat, which, having to be effected in the face of an army superior in cavalry, and betwixt woods and rivers, through a country entirely hostile, appeared almost impracticable. He hastily retired toward the forest, intending to penetrate through Bohemia into Saxony, but he was obliged to sacrifice 3 regiments at Neuburg. These, with truly Spartan courage, defended themselves for 4 days behind an old wall, and gained time for Banner to escape. He retreated by Igra to Annaberg. Piccolomini took a shorter route in pursuit by Schlackenwald, and Banner succeeded only by a single half-hour in clearing the pass of Prieznitz, and saving his whole army from the Imperialists. At Zwickau he was again joined by Guebriant, and both generals directed their march toward Halberstadt, after in vain attempting to defend the Saar, and to prevent the passage of the Imperialists. Banner at length terminated his career in Halberstadt in May 1641, a victim to vexation and disappointment. He sustained with great renown, though with varying success, the reputation of the Swedish arms in Germany, and by a train of victories showed himself worthy of his great master in the art of war. He was fertile in expedient, which he planned with secrecy, and executed with boldness. Cautious in the midst of dangers, greater in adversity than in prosperity, and never more formidable than when upon the brink of destruction. But the virtues of the hero were united with all the railings and vices which a military life creates, or at least fosters. As imperious in private life as he was at the head of his army, rude as his profession, and proud as a conqueror, he oppressed the German princes no less by his haughtiness than their country by his contributions. He consoled himself for the toils of war in voluptuousness and the pleasures of the table, in which he indulged to excess, and was thus brought to an early grave. But though as much addicted to pleasure as Alexander or Mahomet II, he hurried from the arms of luxury into hardest fatigues, and placed himself in all vigour at the head of his army, at the very moment his soldiers were murmuring at his luxurious excesses. Nearly 80,000 men fell in the numerous battles which he fought, and about 600 hostile standards and colours, which he sent to Stockholm, were the trophies of his victories. The want of this great general was soon severely felt by the Swedes, who feared with justice that the loss would not readily be replaced. The spirit of rebellion and insubordination, which had been overawed by the imperious demeanour of this dreaded commander, awoke upon his death. The officers with alarming unanimity demanded payment of their arrears, and none of the 4 generals who shared the commands possessed influence enough to satisfy these demands, or to silence the malcontents. All discipline was at an end. Increasing want and the imperial citation were daily diminishing the number of the army. The troops of France and Weimar showed little zeal. Those of Lunenburg forsook the Swedish colours. Princes also of the House of Brunswick, after the death of Duke George, had formed a separate treaty with the Emperor, and at last even those of Hesse quitted them, to seek better quarters in Westphalia. The enemy profited by these calamitous divisions, and although defeated with loss in 2 pitched battles, succeeded in making considerable progress in Lower Saxony. At length appeared the new Swedish generalissimo with fresh troops and money. This was Bernhard Torstensson, a pupil of Gustavus Adolphus and his most successful imitator, who had been his page during the Polish War. Though a martyr to the gout and confined to a litter, he surpassed all his opponents in activity, and his enterprises had wings, while his body was held by the most frightful of fetters. Under him the scene of war was changed, and new maxim adopted, which necessity dictated and the issue justified. All the countries in which the contest had hitherto raged were exhausted, while the House of Austria, safe in its more distant territories, felt not the miseries of the war under which the rest of Germany groaned. Torstensson first furnished them with this bitter experience, glutted his Swedes on the fertile produce of Austria, and carried the torch of war to the very footstep of the imperial throne. In Silesia, the enemy had gained considerable advantages over the Swedish general Stalhantsch, and driven him as far as Neumark. Torstensson, who had joined the main body of the Swedes in Lunenburg, summoned him to unite with his force, and in the year 1642 hastily marched into Silesia through Brandenburg, which, under its great elector, had begun to maintain an armed neutrality. Glogau was carried, sword in hand, without a breach or formal approaches. The Duke Francis Albert of Lauenburg defeated and killed at Schweidnitz, and Schweidnitz itself, with almost all the towns on that side of the Oder taken. He now penetrated with irresistible violence into the interior of Moravia, where no enemy of Austria had hitherto appeared, took Olmütz, and threw Vienna itself into consternation. But in the meantime, Piccolomini and the Archduke Leopold had collected a superior force, which speedily drove the Swedish conqueror from Moravia, and, after a fruitless attempt upon Brieg, from Silesia. Reinforced by Wrangel, the Swedes again attempted to make the head against the enemy, and relieved Gross-Glogau, but could neither bring the Imperialists to an engagement, nor carry into effect their own views upon Bohemia. Overrunning Lusatia, they took Zittau, in presence of the enemy, and after a short stay in that country, directed their march toward the Elbe, which they passed at Torgau. Torstensson now threatened Leipzig with a siege, and hoped to raise a large supplies of the provisions and contributions from that prosperous town, which for 10 years had been unvisited with the scourge of war. The Imperialists under Leopold and Piccolomini immediately hastened by Dresden to its relief, and Torstensson, to avoid being enclosed between this army and the town, boldly advanced to meet them in order of battle. By a strange coincidence, the two armies met upon the very spot which, 11 years before, Gustavus Adolphus had rendered remarkable by a decisive victory, and the heroism of their predecessors now kindled in the Swedes a noble emulation on this consecrated ground. The Swedish generals Stalhantsch and Wellenberg led their divisions with such impetuosity upon the left wing of the Imperialists before it was completely formed, and the whole cavalry that covered it were dispersed and rendered unserviceable. But the left of the Swedes were threatened with a similar fate, when the victorious right advanced to its assistance, took the enemy in flank and rear, and divided the Austrian line. The infantry on both sides stood firm as a wall, and when their ammunition was exhausted, maintained the combat with the butt ends of their muskets, till at last the Imperialists, completely surrounded, after a contest of 3 hours, were compelled to abandon the field. The generals on both sides had more than once to rally their flying troops, and the Archduke Leopold with his regiment was the first in the attack and the last in flight. But this bloody victory cost the Swedes more than 3,000 men, and 2 of their best generals, Schlangen and Lilienhoek. More than 5,000 of the Imperialists were left upon the field, and nearly as many taken prisoners. Their whole artillery, consisting of 46 field pieces, the silver plate and the portfolio of the Archduke, with the whole baggage of the army, fell into the hands of the victors. Torstensohn, too greatly disabled by his victory to pursue the enemy, moved upon Leipzig. The defeated army retired into Bohemia, where its shattered regiment reassembled. The Archduke Leopold could not recover from the vexation caused by this defeat, and the regiment of cavalry, which by its premature flight had occasioned the disaster, experienced the effects of his indignation. At Rakonitz in Bohemia, in the presence of the whole army, he publicly declared it infamous, deprived it of its horses, arms, and ensigns, ordered its standard to be torn, condemned to death several of the officers, and decimated the privates. The surrender of Leipzig, 3 weeks after the battle, was its brilliant result. The city was obliged to clothe the Swedish troops anew, and to purchase an exemption from plunder, by a contribution of 300,000 Rixdollars, to which all the foreign merchants who had warehouses in the city were to furnish their quota. In the middle of winter, Torstensohn advanced against Freiberg, and for several weeks defied the inclemency of the season, hoping by his perseverance to weary out the obstinacy of the besieged. But he found that he was merely sacrificing the lives of his soldiers, and at last the approach of the imperial general Piccolomini compelled him, with his weakened army, to retire. He considered it, however, as equivalent to a victory, to have disturbed the repose of the enemy in their winter quarters, who, by the severity of the weather, sustained the loss of 3,000 horses. He now made a movement toward the Oder, as if with the view of reinforcing himself with the garrisons of Pomerania and Silesia, but with the rapidity of lightning he again appeared upon the Bohemian frontier, penetrated through that kingdom, and relieved Olmütz in Moravia, which was hard pressed by the Imperialists. His camp at Dobichau, 2 miles from Olmütz, commanded the whole of Moravia, on which he levied heavy contributions, and carried his ravages almost to the gates of Vienna. In vain did the Emperor attempt to arm the Hungarian nobility in defence of this province. They appealed to their privileges, and refused to serve beyond the limits of their own country. Thus, the time that should have been spent in active resistance was lost in fruitless negotiations, and the entire province was abandoned to the ravages of the Swedes. While Torstensohn, by his marches and his victories, astonished friends and foe, the armies of the Allies had not been inactive in other parts of the empire. The troops of Hesse, under Count of Eberstein, and those of Weimar, under Mareschal de Guebriant, had fallen into the electorate of Cologne, in order to take up their winter quarters there. To get rid of these troublesome guests, the Elector called to his assistance the Imperial General Hatzfeld, and assembled his own troops under General Lamboy. The latter was attacked by the Allies in January 1642, and in a decisive action near Kempen, defeated with the loss of about 2,000 men killed, and about twice as many prisoners. This important victory opened to them the whole electorate and the neighbouring territories, so that the Allies were not only enabled to maintain their winter quarters there, but drew from the country large supplies of men and horses. Guebriant left the Hessians to defend their conquests on the Lower Rhine against Hatzfeld, and advanced toward Thuringia, as if to second the operation of Torstensohn in Saxony. But instead of joining the Swede, he soon hurried back to the Rhine and the Main, from which he seemed to think he had removed farther than was expedient. But being anticipated in Margravate of Baden, and by the Bavarians under Mercy and John de Werth, he was obliged to wander about for several weeks, exposed without shelter to the inclemency of the winter, and generally encamping upon the snow, till he found a miserable refuge in Breisgau. He at last took the field, and in the next summer, by keeping the Bavarian army employed in Swabia, prevented it from relieving Thionville, which was besieged by Conde. But the superiority of the enemy soon drove him back to Alsace, where he awaited reinforcement. The death of Cardinal Richelieu took place in November 1642, and the subsequent change in the throne and in the ministry, occasioned by the death of Louis XIII, had for some time withdrawn the attention of France from the German war, and was the cause of the inaction of its troops in the field. But Mazarin, the inheritor not only of Richelieu's power, but also of his principles and his project, followed out with renewed zeal the plans of his predecessor, though the French subject was destined to pay dearly enough for the political greatness of his country. The main strength of its armies, which Richelieu had employed against the Spaniards, was by Mazarin directed against the Emperor, and the anxiety with which he carried on war in Germany proved the sincerity of his opinion that German army was the right arm of his king, and a wall of safety around France. Immediately upon the surrender of Thionville, he sent a considerable reinforcement to Field Marshal Guebriant in Alsace, and to encourage the troops to bear the fatigues of the German war. The celebrated Victor of Rocroi, the Duke of Enghien, afterwards Prince of Conde, was placed at their head. Guebriant now felt himself strong enough to appear again in Germany with repute. He hastened across the Rhine with the view of procuring better winter quarters in Swabia, and actually made himself master of Rothweil, where a Bavarian magazine fell into his hands. But the place was too dearly purchased for its worth, and was again lost even more speedily than it had been taken. Guebriant received a wound in the arm, which the surgeon's unskilfulness rendered mortal, and the extent of his loss was felt on the very day of his death. End of Part 4.